I was slipping my arms into my cashmere coat, preparing to attend a reconciliation dinner at my older brother Terrance's mansion. It had been a full year since we last spoke. I genuinely thought tonight was about healing old wounds. Then my phone buzzed heavily in my pocket. It was a text message from Elena, the housekeeper, who had worked for my brother for 10 long years. The message simply said, "Do not come, it is a trap." Below the text was a high-resolution photograph Elena had secretly taken of a document sitting on Terrance's heavy mahogany desk. I zoomed in on the image and my blood ran ice-cold in my veins. It was a legal petition for a full medical and financial conservatorship over me. Before I could even process the magnitude of this betrayal, a second message came through. It was an audio clip. I pressed play and heard the unmistakable shrill laugh of my sister-in-law Blair. She was saying that all they had to do was slip a few heavy sedatives into my wine tonight. She bragged to someone in the room that her crooked psychiatrist friend would be waiting at the dinner table to officially declare me mentally unstable from the prolonged grief of losing my husband. Before I continue this unbelievable story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your intelligence and your strength. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I turned their sinister trap into their absolute ruin. My name is Valerie, and I am 32 years old. 3 years ago, my entire world shattered when I lost my husband to a sudden, unexpected illness. I was 29 years old and completely devastated by the loss of my soulmate. But instead of breaking down permanently, I poured every single ounce of my grief and energy into the business we had started together. Over the next 3 years, I built our small trucking and logistics company into a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up. I worked grueling 18-hour days securing international shipping routes, negotiating massive fleet contracts, and outsmarting older competitors in a fiercely male-dominated industry. I became a highly successful self-made woman with a bank account to match my relentless daily hustle. Meanwhile, my older brother Terrance was always the undisputed golden child of our family. Terrance is 36, an Ivy League university graduate, and the supposed absolute genius of our bloodline. My mother, Corinne, worshipped the very ground he walked on. She spent her entire life making sure Terrance had the best private tutors, the newest sports cars, and the finest tailored clothes, while I was expected to just figure things out on my own. Terrance grew up to become the chief executive officer of a venture capital firm. He married Blair, a 31-year-old white woman who came from old money and possessed an astonishing level of pure arrogance. Blair loved to spend Terrance's money recklessly, and she never missed an opportunity to throw subtle microaggressions my way. She would often make backhanded, condescending compliments about how articulate I was, or express fake concern about how a single black woman could possibly handle the extreme stress of running a nationwide trucking empire. For the past 12 months, I had completely cut them off. Their constant belittling and toxic behavior had become way too much for me to bear. But last week, my mother had practically begged me over the phone to attend this Sunday dinner. She cried and claimed Terrance desperately wanted to apologize and bring the family back together. I had let my guard down, hoping that maybe, just maybe, my older brother actually missed his sister. Standing alone in my silent foyer, staring at the horrific messages on my phone, I realized there was absolutely no love left in my family. There was only pure, unadulterated greed. Terrance and Blair were not trying to reconcile with me. They were actively conspiring to drug me, declare me legally incompetent, and steal my entire logistics empire to fund their lavish, failing lifestyle. Most people would have collapsed on the floor in tears or called the local police department immediately. But I did not shed a single tear. My tears had completely dried up 3 years ago when I buried the love of my life. Instead of panicking, a profound and dangerous sense of clarity washed over my entire body. I slowly took off my cashmere coat and walked back into my home office. I sat down at my leather desk chair and entered full boss mode. First, I dialed the direct emergency line to Marcus, the head of my private corporate security firm. Marcus was a former military operative who handled all the risk management for my national shipping fleet. I told him the exact suburban address of Terrance's mansion and instructed him to assemble a specialized tactical team immediately. I gave him a precise timeline and told him to wait silently outside the property for my specific signal. Next, I called my lead corporate litigator. I explained the conservatorship document Elena had photographed and played him the audio recording of Blair discussing sedatives and a crooked doctor. My lawyer was dead silent for exactly 3 seconds before he told me this was no longer a simple family dispute. It was a serious criminal conspiracy to commit medical fraud and financial extortion. He strongly advised me to stay home, lock my doors, and let the federal authorities handle the situation. But I absolutely refused to hide. If I stayed home, Terrance would simply destroy the physical documents, delete the evidence, and deny everything. He would hide safely behind his expensive custom suits and his Ivy League vocabulary. I needed to catch them completely red-handed. I needed them to believe their sick plan was working perfectly right up until the exact moment I tore their privileged lives apart. I texted Elena back, thanking her for her incredible loyalty and instructing her to act completely normal around them. I told her to make absolutely sure the back security door of the mansion was left unlocked. Then I walked into my bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I smoothed out my silk blouse and carefully reapplied my lipstick. I practiced a soft, grieving, vulnerable smile. I had to perfectly play the part of the lonely, depressed widow they assumed I was. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door. The entire way I listened to classical piano music, keeping my heart rate steady and my mind razor sharp. I was about to walk directly into a den of vipers. My own mother, my brother, and my sister-in-law were waiting in that dining room, ready to drug me and strip away my freedom. They thought they were dealing with a broken woman who desperately needed family validation. They had absolutely no idea they were about to go to war with a logistics chief executive officer who planned every single move 10 steps ahead. The drive to the wealthy gated suburbs took exactly 45 minutes and gave me plenty of time to mentally prepare for the battlefield I was about to step onto. The iron gates of Terrance's sprawling estate slowly parted as I pulled my car into the wide circular driveway. His house was a massive glass and stone monstrosity that screamed of new money and hidden crushing debt. It was the kind of house you buy when you want everyone to think you are a billionaire, even though your venture capital firm is secretly hemorrhaging cash. I parked my car and took one final deep breath before stepping out into the chilly evening air. I smoothed the fabric of my coat and walked up the grand stone steps. The massive oak front doors swung open before I even reached the top step. Elena stood there in her crisp uniform. Her eyes met mine for a brief fraction of a second, but her expression remained completely neutral. She was a true professional. I gave her a nearly imperceptible nod of gratitude as I walked past her into the grand foyer. The house smelled heavily of expensive wax candles and the distinct cold scent of polished marble. Almost immediately, the sharp clicking of designer heels echoed across the foyer floor. It was Blair. She was wearing a ridiculous emerald silk cocktail dress that looked entirely too formal for a simple Sunday family dinner. "Valerie, darling, you actually made it!" she practically shrieked. She threw her arms around me in an overly tight, aggressive hug. Her expensive floral perfume was suffocating, and her embrace felt like a snake wrapping around its prey. When she pulled back, her smile did not reach her pale eyes. They were wide and darting nervously around my face. Before I could even take off my coat, Blair was already forcing a heavy crystal glass of dark red wine into my right hand. "Drink up, honey. You look so stressed," she said. Her voice was an octave higher than usual, betraying her anxiety. I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers when she released the glass into my grip. She was practically vibrating with nervous anticipation, waiting for me to consume the heavy sedatives she had crushed into the vintage blend. "You have been working yourself into the ground ever since Adam passed away, and you really need to relax tonight," Blair added while watching my face closely. I looked down at the dark liquid swirling in the glass. The trap was already fully set and they were eager to spring it. I offered her my most convincing tired and vulnerable smile. "You are absolutely right, Blair. I have been so exhausted lately," I replied. A flash of pure triumphant malice crossed her face. She thought she had already won. She turned around for just a moment to yell an instruction at Elena about serving the warm appetizers. That was all the time I needed. I quickly stepped toward a massive potted ficus plant resting against the foyer wall and poured the entire glass of wine directly into the dark soil. The liquid absorbed instantly. By the time Blair turned back around, I was raising the empty rim to my lips and pretending to swallow a large, heavy gulp. I let out a soft, dramatic sigh and lowered the glass. "Oh, this vintage is incredibly strong," I lied, rubbing my chest slightly. Blair looked at the nearly empty glass, and her smile widened into something genuinely sinister. "Excellent," she purred, grabbing my arm to lead me forward. "Now let us go into the dining room because Terrance and your mother are waiting for us." I followed her clicking heels down the long hallway. My mind was racing, calculating every possible angle, but my heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calm. I stepped into the formal dining room and was immediately hit by the overwhelming scent of roasted meats and suffocating floral centerpieces. The dining table was a massive slab of dark mahogany set with fine china and polished silver. My mother Corinne was sitting near the head of the long table. She wore her best pearls and a smug look of maternal satisfaction. She did not even stand up to greet me. Terrance stood near the grand stone fireplace, holding a heavy glass of expensive scotch. He looked exactly like the corporate vulture he truly was, wearing a custom-tailored suit inside his own home on a Sunday evening. But my eyes immediately locked onto the two strangers sitting on the opposite side of the table. They looked entirely out of place at an intimate family dinner. One was a middle-aged man with thinning gray hair, wearing a beige cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses. He had the soft, overly calm demeanor of a medical professional who specialized in telling people what they wanted to hear for a price. Sitting next to him was a slick-looking man in a cheap, shiny gray suit who nervously tapped a gold pen against a leather notebook. His eyes darted around the room like a rat trapped in a maze. "Valerie, I am so glad you could join us," Terrance said smoothly, walking over to kiss my cheek. His breath smelled of alcohol and cheap lies. "I want to introduce you to a couple of close personal friends who dropped by to say hello. This is Dr. Evans. He is a highly respected specialist in grief counseling and behavioral therapy. And this is Mr. Davis, a legal consultant who occasionally advises my firm on complex matters." My mother chimed in immediately with a sickly sweet tone that made my skin crawl. "We just thought it would be nice to have some professional support tonight, Valerie. You have been struggling so much lately, and we are all just so terribly worried about your fragile mental health." I looked slowly from my mother to my brother and then to the two hired accomplices. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. They really thought I was a stupid, grief-stricken widow. They honestly believed they could isolate me, drug me, and interrogate me right here in this dining room while a crooked doctor took notes to build a fraudulent medical profile. I pulled out my heavy wooden chair and gracefully sat down at the table. The heavy dining room doors clicked shut behind me, sealing us in. The deadly dinner had officially begun. I folded my hands neatly on my lap and looked directly into the eyes of Dr. Evans. "It is so wonderful to meet you, Doctor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and polite. "It is always fascinating to meet friends of my brother, especially those who make professional house calls on a Sunday evening." The doctor shifted uncomfortably in his seat and offered a tight practice smile. Mr. Davis, the sleazy attorney, stopped tapping his pen and stared at me intensely, trying to read my demeanor. Blair hurried to her seat across from me and watched me with hawk eyes. She was waiting for the heavy sedatives to kick in. She kept glancing at my empty wine glass on the foyer table and then back to my face, expecting me to start slurring my words or lose my physical balance. I decided to play along just a little bit longer to make their eventual fall that much more devastating. I let my shoulders slump slightly and purposely slowed down my blinking. I raised a hand and rubbed my temples as if a sudden wave of extreme fatigue was washing over my brain. Blair's eyes lit up with malicious joy across the table. She nudged Terrance gently under the table, thinking their sinister plan was working flawlessly. "Are you feeling all right?" Valerie, Terrance asked, pretending to sound concerned, but completely failing to hide the eager edge in his voice. "Maybe running that massive trucking company all by yourself is finally taking its toll on your state of mind. You look incredibly pale, sister." The level of disrespect was absolutely staggering. They were not just trying to steal my multi-million-dollar company, they were actively trying to erase my sanity, my freedom, and my entire identity. I took a deep breath of the stifling air in the room. I knew Marcus and my elite corporate security team were waiting in unmarked vehicles just outside the property line, ready to breach the doors on my command. I knew my lead litigator was already preparing the federal charges for medical extortion and fraud. I was the one holding all the cards, but I needed them to put their entire fraudulent plan on the table before I flipped it over and destroyed them. "I am fine, Terrance," I whispered softly, leaning back in my chair and fluttering my eyelids. "Just a little tired and dizzy all of a sudden. Please let us just enjoy the dinner." Terrance smirked and signaled to Elena to start serving the first course. He looked over at the corrupt doctor and gave a subtle, confident nod. The lion had opened its jaws wide and tried to swallow me whole. But little did they know they had just swallowed a live grenade. Elena quietly placed a bowl of roasted butternut squash soup in front of me and retreated to the kitchen without making a single sound. The silver spoon felt heavy in my hand as I looked across the table at the hired professionals. Dr. Evans cleared his throat and leaned forward, folding his hands, resting them on the dark wood. He began his psychological assault with a soft, patronizing tone that instantly made my skin crawl. "Valerie, your brother tells me that you have been working practically day and night since Adam's tragic passing," he said. "It is quite common for widows to use excessive labor as a coping mechanism to avoid confronting their deep-seated anger and emotional instability." He intentionally used the words anger and instability to plant a seed. He wanted me to react. I did not take the bait. Instead, I slowly lifted my spoon to my mouth and tasted the warm soup. "It is delicious, Elena," I said aloud, completely ignoring the doctor for a brief, calculated moment. Then I turned my steady gaze back to the balding man in the beige cardigan. "Work is not a coping mechanism, Dr. Evans. It is a responsibility," I replied evenly. "Adam and I built a logistics network that employs over 400 people, and they rely on my leadership to feed their families." My tone was flat and devoid of any raw emotion. Blair shifted in her seat, visibly disappointed that I had not snapped at the intrusive comment. She glanced quickly toward the large crystal chandelier hanging above the dining table, and then toward a decorative bookshelf in the corner of the room. My eyes naturally followed her subtle, anxious movements. That is when I saw it. Tucked discreetly behind a set of heavy leather-bound encyclopedias was a small black device with a tiny lens pointed directly at my face. I let my eyes scan the room further without turning my head. There was another small lens hidden inside the ornate floral arrangement near the grand stone fireplace. They had rigged the dining room with hidden cameras. The realization hit me like a splash of ice water, but it only sharpened my dangerous focus. They were trying to provoke a manic reaction so they could record an outburst and build a fraudulent case for intermittent explosive disorder. If I raised my voice, threw a glass, or broke down crying, they would have all the video evidence they needed to lock me away in a facility. Dr. Evans pushed harder, leaning even closer across the table, invading my personal space. "But Valerie, surely, you must feel a deep, profound rage that Adam abandoned you." He pressed his voice dripping with fake professional sympathy. "Some days you must want to just scream and break things to release the unbearable pressure of being entirely alone in the world." He was feeding me the exact script he wanted me to perform for the hidden lenses. My mother, Corinne, nodded along solemnly, wiping a completely dry eye with her expensive linen napkin. "It is okay to let it out, honey," she added, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "We are your family, and this is a safe space for you to finally break down and show us your crazy side." The sheer manipulative evil of their setup was breathtaking. I took another slow, calm bite of my soup. I looked directly into the hidden camera on the bookshelf and then locked eyes with the corrupt doctor. "I do not feel rage, doctor. I feel extreme clarity." I answered, my voice so steady it echoed slightly in the large, silent room. "Adam did not abandon me. He suffered a fatal cerebral hemorrhage, which is a biological tragedy, not a personal betrayal." According to the American Psychological Association, acute grief typically transitions into integrated grief within 12 months for individuals with strong baseline resilience. I have successfully integrated my loss and channeled my operational focus into expanding our corporate fleet by 30% in the last fiscal quarter alone. I paused and gave him a chillingly polite smile. "Tell me, Dr. Evans, as a board-certified professional, do you typically diagnose successful corporate expansion as a symptom of severe emotional instability?" A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended upon the dining room. Dr. Evans blinked rapidly, his confident demeanor suddenly cracking under the immense weight of my calculated logic. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated entirely, unsure of how to handle a target who was analyzing his medical tactics in real time. He nervously reached up and wiped a small bead of sweat that had formed on his forehead. Terrance scowled deeply, his jaw clenching as he realized his hired professional was losing control of the psychological interrogation. "Well, Valerie, you can use all the fancy corporate buzzwords you want, but you cannot hide the fact that you are deeply unwell," Terrance interjected loudly. "You refuse to date, you isolate yourself in that massive empty house, and you have completely alienated your own blood relatives." He was trying to tag team with the doctor to back me into a mental corner. Mr. Davis, the sleazy attorney, furiously scribbled notes in his leather pad, trying to document anything that could possibly be twisted against my character. I placed my spoon down perfectly parallel to my soup bowl, aligning it with absolute geometric precision. "Terrance, I isolate myself from toxicity, not from society," I replied without raising my voice a single decibel. "I engage daily with international shipping executives, dock workers, and logistics managers. My social interactions are highly functional and professionally lucrative. As for alienating my blood relatives, I simply implemented a strict boundary against individuals who display classic narcissistic tendencies and financial parasitism." I looked directly at Blair when I said the word parasitism, and her pale skin flushed a deep, angry red. "How dare you speak to us like that after we went out of our way to stage an intervention for your own good?" Blair snapped, her voice shrill and highly defensive. "You are acting completely paranoid and delusional, Valerie." There is the magic word, I thought to myself. Delusional. They desperately needed me to look delusional for their hidden cameras. But instead of defending myself against her pathetic insult, I turned my attention back to the sweating psychiatrist. "Dr. Evans, you are a medical professional observing this interaction," I stated calmly. "Would you characterize my current resting heart rate and vocal modulation as erratic? Or would you say I am demonstrating a remarkably high level of emotional regulation under targeted duress?" The doctor tugged nervously at the collar of his beige cardigan. He glanced sideways at Terrance, looking like a man who suddenly realized he was not getting paid nearly enough to deal with this level of intellectual resistance. "Well, Valerie, presentation can sometimes mask deeper underlying pathology," he stammered weakly, avoiding direct eye contact with me. "Some patients exhibit a cold detachment, which is actually a severe dissociative state." My mother, Corinne, decided she needed to rescue their failing strategy. She reached across the table and tried to grab my hand. "Valerie, please stop fighting us," she whined, her face contorted in an ugly mask of fake concern. "Adam would be so ashamed to see the heartless, robotic monster you have become." That was a direct, low blow intended to shatter my emotional core. They expected the mention of Adam's shame to be the final trigger that would make me snap. I gently pulled my hand away from my mother's grasp, as if her skin was covered in toxic poison. I did not flinch, and my breathing remained perfectly rhythmic. Mother Adam loved me precisely because I possess the intellectual fortitude to handle difficult situations without losing my composure, I replied softly. He would not be ashamed of my strength, but he would certainly be disgusted by this theatrical performance you are putting on for an audience of hired strangers. I smiled gently, completely dismantling their entire effort. A dissociative state would imply a disconnect from reality, doctor, I countered smoothly, turning back to the terrified physician. Yet I am acutely aware of reality right now. I am aware that the ambient temperature in this room is exactly 72 degrees. I am aware that the red wine Blair served me in the foyer was heavily spiked, which is why I poured it into a potted plant. And I am intimately aware that any behavioral health assessment conducted without a patient's prior consent in a non-clinical setting violates the Medical Ethics Board guidelines. The moment those words left my mouth, the sleazy attorney, Mr. Davis, completely stopped writing. His pen hovered over the paper, and he looked up at me with sudden, genuine fear in his eyes. Dr. Evans' face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The psychological trap they had spent weeks building had just snapped shut, right on their own fingers. They thought they were hunting a fragile, wounded animal, but they had invited a calculated apex predator to their dinner table. I sat perfectly still, breathing evenly, and waited for their next desperate move. The silence in the room stretched out until it became heavy and suffocating. Mr. Davis slowly placed his gold pen down on the leather notebook, realizing that any further notes would only incriminate him. Seeing that her highly paid medical mercenary had just been intellectually slaughtered, my mother Corinne decided it was time to step into the spotlight. She let out a long, trembling sigh that sounded like a deflating balloon. She pushed her bowl of soup away, as if the mere thought of food was suddenly repulsive to her deeply concerned maternal soul. "Oh, Valerie," she began, her voice quivering with a perfectly rehearsed fragility. "Why must you always turn everything into a battle? Dr. Evans is only trying to help you navigate this unbearable darkness. Look at you sitting there so rigid and cold. You are completely losing your grip on reality, and it is breaking my heart to watch my only daughter destroy herself." I watched the fake tears pool in the corners of her eyes. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She reached across the dark mahogany table again, this time resting her hand palm up in a gesture of absolute surrender. She wanted the hidden cameras to capture a loving mother reaching out to her deeply disturbed child. "Honey, you need to be honest with yourself," she continued, her tone dripping with saccharine sympathy. "You are a grieving widow, trying to run a rough, dirty trucking business, surrounded by aggressive men who do not respect you. The logistics industry is no place for a fragile woman who just buried her husband. The stress is clearly causing you to hallucinate these wild corporate conspiracy theories. You are completely exhausted, Valerie, and your mind is starting to fracture under the heavy burden of all those massive diesel trucks and shipping manifests." She paused to dramatically wipe her dry cheek. "You have done enough," my mother whispered softly. "It is time to step down and let someone who is actually equipped to handle high-level corporate stress take the wheel. Terrance is your big brother. He is a brilliant Ivy League graduate with a proven track record in executive management. He knows how to structure a board of directors, and he knows how to handle complex financial portfolios. If you just sign the papers and transfer the chief executive title to him tonight, you can finally rest. You can check into that beautiful private facility Blair found for you and just sleep. Terrance will make sure you receive a generous monthly allowance so you never have to worry about money again." Then my mother leaned in closer, preparing to deliver the absolute fatal emotional blow. "Adam always worried about how stubborn you were, Valerie," she whispered. weaponizing the memory of my dead husband with terrifying precision. Before he passed, he told me he was exhausted. He said you pushed him too hard and that your blind ambition was tearing your marriage apart. Maybe if you had focused more on being a supportive traditional wife instead of a ruthless boss, he would not have suffered that terrible stroke. It is your own crushing guilt that is driving you completely insane. The pure cruelty of her words hung in the stifling air of the dining room. My own mother was sitting in front of hired strangers, explicitly blaming me for the sudden biological aneurysm that took the life of the only man who ever truly loved me. It was a masterclass in narcissistic abuse. She expected me to burst into hysterical tears. She expected me to fall to pieces and sign whatever documents they placed in front of me, just to make the psychological torture stop. Blair leaned forward eagerly, anticipating my total mental collapse. Terrance swirled the ice in his expensive Scotch glass, looking incredibly pleased with his mother's vicious tactics. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow disgust. She sat there adorned in expensive pearls purchased with my brother's venture capital money, looking down on the very industry that had made me a self-made millionaire. She called my business rough and dirty. She called me fragile. She actually believed that Terrance was the brilliant savior of the family, simply because he possessed an expensive piece of paper from an elite university. "Mother," I said, my voice cutting through her theatrical performance like a surgical scalpel, "do you honestly believe that Terrance is more qualified to run my logistics empire simply because he bought his way into an Ivy League school with the family savings? Let us review the actual history of this family, shall we?" I leaned forward slightly, making sure my face was perfectly framed by the hidden camera near the fireplace. I wanted every single word of this to be recorded in crystal clear, high-definition audio for the federal investigators who were waiting outside. When I was 16 years old, I worked 3 part-time jobs just to afford my own college applications because you told me the family educational fund was completely depleted, I stated calmly. Never breaking eye contact with her. You said there was no money left for me. Yet magically, that exact same year, Terrance was gifted a brand new sports car for his college graduation and a fully paid luxury apartment in the city, so he could focus on his unpaid prestigious internship. I rode the city bus at 4 in the morning to scrub floors at a commercial bakery before school, and Terrance complained that the leather seats in his new car were the wrong shade of black. My mother opened her mouth to interrupt, but I simply raised one finger, silencing her instantly. Adam and I did not build a rough, dirty business, Mother. We built an airtight, highly efficient supply chain network that operates with military precision. We started with one single used delivery van that Adam bought with his life savings. I dispatched the routes from a folding table in our tiny one-bedroom apartment while he drove for 18 hours a day. We ate cheap instant noodles for 3 years while we invested every single penny of profit back into the fleet. We did not have a venture capital safety net. We did not have an Ivy League alumni network handing us lucrative contracts on a silver platter. We had nothing but grit, sweat, and pure relentless hustle. Terrance scoffed loudly from the end of the table, taking another large gulp of his scotch. "Oh, please, Valerie, do not act like you are some kind of blue-collar martyr," he sneered. "You got lucky with a few corporate contracts during a shipping boom. It takes real financial intellect to sustain a company of that size, an intellect you simply do not possess." I shifted my gaze to my older brother, taking in his custom-tailored suit and his arrogant smirk. "Terrance, you have never built anything with your own 2 hands in your entire life?" I replied smoothly. "You take other people's money, you charge them exorbitant management fees, and you call yourself a genius when the market goes up. And when the market goes down, you simply blame the economic climate while continuing to collect your massive executive salary. You would not survive one single week running a real operational business. You would crumble the second a union strike threatened your bottom line, or a massive winter storm disrupted your entire routing schedule." Corinne slammed her hand down on the table, the silverware clattering loudly against the fine china. Valerie, that is enough, she shouted, her facade of the heartbroken mother finally slipping to reveal the bitter, angry woman hiding underneath. Your brother is a highly respected chief executive officer. He operates in boardrooms with billionaires while you deal with sweaty truck drivers. You should be on your knees thanking him for being willing to step in and save your little company from certain bankruptcy. You are a sick, grieving widow who is completely out of touch with reality. I looked at her angry red face and smiled a genuine, chilling smile. You are right about one thing, Mother, I said softly. I do deal with sweaty truck drivers. And do you know what I learned from them? I learned how to spot a massive pile of garbage from a mile away. The sleazy attorney, Mr. Davis, let out a sudden choked cough, trying to cover a gasp. Blair's jaw dropped open in pure shock. Terrance gripped his scotch glass so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter in his bare hand. My mother simply stared at me, her chest heaving with indignant rage. She had completely failed to gaslight me into submission. She had failed to convince me that my life was a chaotic mess. And most importantly, she had failed to realize that her precious golden boy was not the savior of this family, but rather a desperate drowning man trying to pull me under the water with him. The heavy silence that followed my statement was quickly broken by the sharp scraping of a chair against the hardwood floor. Blair could no longer contain her entitled outrage. She leaned across the table, her emerald silk dress rustling loudly, and pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. Valerie, that is exactly the kind of toxic, hostile behavior that proves you are completely unhinged, she spat, her voice trembling with manufactured indignation. Your mother and brother are sitting here offering you a lifeline and you attack them like some wild animal. You know, this is exactly why people in our social circle find you so intimidating. You are always so loud and so defensive. It is the classic angry stereotype, and it is frankly exhausting to watch. I looked at my sister-in-law, letting her racially coded insult hang in the air for a long moment. She was using the same tired playbook she always used whenever she felt intellectually cornered. She wanted to paint me as the aggressive, unstable black woman while she played the delicate, refined peacemaker. Blair, I said, my tone dropping to a soft, dangerous whisper. The only thing exhausting in this room is watching you pretend to care about my well-being when we both know you just maxed out Terrance's platinum credit card at a luxury boutique yesterday. You do not care about my mental health. You care about maintaining your country club membership, and you are terrified that your husband's failing venture capital firm can no longer fund your shopping addiction. Blair's pale face instantly drained of all color. Her jaw snapped shut, and she looked nervously at Terrance. Terrance slammed his heavy crystal glass down on the mahogany table so hard, the remaining scotch sloshed over the rim and stained the pristine white tablecloth. Enough, Terrance roared, his deep voice echoing off the high ceiling of the dining room. The charming Ivy League facade completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but raw, desperate greed. He stood up, towering over the table, and reached inside the breast pocket of his custom suit. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and threw them aggressively across the table. The papers slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of my soup bowl. I am done playing these games with you, Valerie, he snarled, pointing fiercely at the documents. Those are full medical and financial conservatorship papers. Dr. Evans has already drafted the medical certificate declaring you an immediate danger to yourself due to severe complicated grief and erratic behavior. All you have to do is pick up that pen and sign full power of attorney over to me. I looked down at the documents. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to mock the very concept of family. I slowly looked back up at my brother. And what exactly happens if I refuse to sign these fraudulent papers, Terrance? I asked, keeping my breathing perfectly slow and measured. Terrance's eyes darkened with pure malice. He snapped his fingers. Immediately, the two massive private security guards who had been standing quietly in the hallway stepped fully into the dining room. They pulled the heavy oak doors shut with a loud, defining click and locked them from the inside. If you do not sign those papers right now, my dear sister Terrance said, leaning over the table with a twisted, sadistic smile, I will have Dr. Evans call an ambulance. My security team will physically restrain you to that chair until the paramedics arrive. We will tell them you suffered a complete psychotic break and violently attacked our mother. Mr. Davis will corroborate our story as an independent legal witness. You will be strapped to a gurney pumped full of heavy sedatives and locked inside a psychiatric ward before midnight. By the time you wake up and try to explain yourself to a judge, I will already have emergency control of your corporate bank accounts. My mother Corinne sat perfectly still at the head of the table. She did not object to her son threatening to have me physically assaulted and chemically restrained. She simply looked down at her lap playing with her expensive pearl necklace. She was entirely complicit in my destruction. The sleazy attorney, Mr. Davis, nervously pushed a gold pen across the table toward me. Just sign the documents, Miss Valerie, he urged, his voice cracking slightly. It will make things so much easier for everyone, and you can finally get the rest you so desperately need. The trap was fully closed. They had locked the doors, hired muscle-falsified medical documents, and completely cornered me in their own home. They expected me to panic. They expected me to look at the massive security guards and the corrupt doctor and finally break down sobbing in utter defeat. Instead, I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound of my laughter in that tense, terrifying room was so completely unexpected that Dr. Evans visibly flinched. Terrance narrowed his eyes, confused and frustrated by my reaction. What exactly is so funny, you crazy witch? Blair hissed, gripping the edges of the table. I picked up the gold pen, rolling it smoothly between my fingers. I am laughing because of how incredibly predictable you all are, I said calmly. Terrance, you spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on an Ivy League education just to execute a criminal conspiracy that a first-year law student could dismantle in 5 minutes. I dropped the pen on the floor and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. Terrance lunged forward, shouting at his guards to grab my phone, but it was already too late. I did not need to make a phone call. I simply pressed a single pre-programmed button on my screen, sending a silent alert to the tactical team waiting directly outside the property line. You really thought you were the smartest person in this room, Terrance, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. You thought you could invite a logistics chief executive to a dinner party and control the environment. But you forgot one fundamental rule of my industry. I never walk into a facility without controlling all the exits, and I never negotiate without overwhelming leverage. 5 seconds later, a massive shattering crash echoed from the front of the house. The sound of heavy boots pounding against the marble foyer floors made Mr. Davis scream in pure terror. The locked dining room doors were suddenly and violently kicked open, shattering the wooden doorframe into 100 jagged splinters. Through the splintered ruins of the dining room doors stepped Marcus, my head of corporate security. He was a mountain of a man dressed in a sharp black suit that barely concealed his extensive tactical training. Behind him, 4 more members of my elite security team flooded into the room, moving with terrifying speed and absolute silence. Terrance's 2 bulky private guards reached for their weapons, but my team had them pinned face first against the custom silk wallpaper before anyone could even blink. The heavy thud of their bodies hitting the wall made the crystal chandelier rattle violently above us, shaking the expensive wine glasses on the table. Terrance stumbled backward, knocking his heavy wooden chair to the floor with a loud crash. He threw his hands up in the air, his face completely devoid of its previous arrogant color. "What is the meaning of this?" he shrieked, his voice cracking like a frightened child. "You cannot just break into my house, Valerie! I will have you all arrested for home invasion!" I remained seated for a moment, simply watching him panic. It was a truly beautiful sight to behold. I slowly stood up from the table and carefully adjusted the cuffs of my silk blouse. "I am not breaking in, Terrance," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice at a conversational volume. "You locked the doors and held me against my will under the direct threat of forced medical restraint. My security team simply responded to a silent distress beacon, indicating a hostile hostage situation. Legally speaking, they just saved your life." Because if you had laid a single finger on me tonight, my corporation would have buried you beneath the prison. Marcus stepped aside, clearing the splintered doorway. Two more figures walked calmly into the dining room. They were not wearing tactical gear. They were wearing immaculate tailored suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. The first man was Mr. Harrison, my lead corporate litigator, and easily one of the most ruthless defense attorneys on the East Coast. The second man was Dr. Cole, an independent board-certified psychiatric examiner who routinely consulted for federal courts. If we are going to have a formal discussion about my mental competence and my financial assets, I figured I should bring my own experts, I said, gesturing politely to the two men. It is only fair, right, Terrance? Blair let out a high-pitched whimper and pressed both hands against her mouth. Her emerald silk dress suddenly looked cheap and ridiculous in the presence of actual authority. She backed away from the table, her designer heels scraping awkwardly against the floor. My mother Corinne sat completely frozen in her chair, staring wide-eyed at the armed men securing the perimeter of the room. She had spent her entire life hiding behind the safe illusion of upper-class civility, and now the harsh, unforgiving reality of corporate warfare was standing right in her dining room. Dr. Evans, the crooked psychiatrist, slowly raised his hands and backed away from the table. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding," he stammered, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his upper lip. "I was only brought here to facilitate a peaceful family mediation. I had absolutely no intention of signing any medical certificates tonight." Dr. Cole placed his briefcase on the table and pulled out a thick, perfectly bound medical file. He dropped it onto the mahogany wood right next to my untouched bowl of soup. "That is incredibly fascinating, Dr. Evans," Dr. Cole said, his voice dripping with professional disdain. "Because my client underwent a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation this very morning under my direct supervision. Her cognitive function is flawless, and she displays zero signs of complicated grief or intermittent explosive disorder. However, I am intensely interested in discussing your ethical decision to diagnose a patient against her will while accepting untraceable payments from a venture capital firm." The color completely drained from Dr. Evans' face. His knees literally buckled, and he had to grab the back of an empty chair just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The sleazy attorney, Mr. Davis, tried to subtly slide his leather notebook into his jacket pocket and edged toward the doorway. Marcus took one single heavy step forward, and Mr. Davis froze in his tracks, holding his breath in absolute terror. "Mr. Harrison," my litigator walked over and picked up the conservatorship papers Terrance had thrown at me earlier. He flipped through the pages with a look of pure amusement. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Terrance with the kind of pity you normally reserve for a dying insect. "This is amateur work, Terrance," Mr. Harrison said, tossing the papers back onto the table like common trash. "The legal precedents you cited are over 10 years out of date. My junior paralegals would be completely embarrassed to submit this garbage to a local judge, let alone a federal magistrate. Did you really think you could seize control of a $50 million national logistics fleet with a generic template you printed off the internet?" Terrance was hyperventilating now. His custom suit clearly felt too tight, and he tugged desperately at his expensive silk tie, trying to get air into his lungs. He looked frantically at our mother, expecting her to somehow save him from this nightmare, but Corinne was entirely silent. Her precious golden boy was being publicly humiliated and systematically dismantled by the daughter she had always considered inferior. "You are trespassing," Terrance managed to whisper, his chest heaving up and down. "Get out of my house right now, Valerie, or I swear to God I will call the local police." I walked slowly around the table, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I stopped right in front of him, forcing him to look me directly in the eye. "Call them, Terrance," I challenged softly. "Pick up your phone right now and call the local police. Tell them you hired 2 unlicensed thugs to lock a chief executive officer in a room and force her to sign away her massive company. Tell them you bribed a medical professional to falsify health records to steal my assets. Please, Terrance, make the call right now. I would absolutely love to see how the local police handle a multi-million-dollar corporate extortion plot. Terrance did not move a single inch. His hands were shaking so violently, he had to press them against his sides. He looked over at Blair, who was now openly weeping, thick streaks of black mascara ruining her expensive makeup. He looked at his mother, who stubbornly refused to meet his gaze. He was completely and utterly trapped in the very cage he had so carefully built for me. "Valerie, please." My mother suddenly spoke up, her voice weak and trembling, breaking the heavy silence. "We are family. There is absolutely no need to ruin your brother's life over a simple misunderstanding. He was just stressed about money and he made a foolish mistake. Please tell these frightening men to leave our family alone." I turned slowly to look at Corinne. The sheer audacity of her plea was almost comical to me. 30 minutes ago, you sat in that exact chair and watched him threaten to strap me to a hospital gurney. "Mother!" I said, my voice echoing loudly in the silent room. "You told me I was a sick, fragile woman who needed to be locked away in an institution. You were perfectly willing to let him destroy my entire life, my reputation and my freedom, just so he could steal my hard-earned money and pay off his hidden debts. This is not a foolish little mistake. This is a calculated criminal conspiracy, and the time for family forgiveness officially expired the exact second those dining room doors locked." I turned my attention back to the sleazy lawyer, Mr. Davis. I pointed a single manicured finger directly at his chest. "Mr. Harrison is going to report your direct involvement in this extortion attempt to the State Bar Association first thing tomorrow morning," I told him without a shred of mercy. "You will be permanently disbarred before the end of the month, and if you are very lucky, you might avoid serving federal prison time. I highly suggest you leave this house right now and start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney." Mr. Davis did not need to be told twice. He grabbed his briefcase and sprinted past Marcus, nearly tripping over his own feet in his desperate panic to escape the mansion. Dr. Evans tried to quietly follow him, but Marcus put a massive heavy hand on his shoulder, shoving him roughly back into the room. "You are not going anywhere, doctor," I said coldly, staring him down. "My legal team has a few more very specific questions for you regarding the offshore shell company Terrance used to pay your bribe." The absolute terror in the room was a living, breathing thing. They had spent my entire life looking down on me and underestimating my intelligence simply because I did not fit their bougie upper-class mold. They thought my success was a fluke, and my grief made me a weak, easy target. But standing in that ruined dining room surrounded by my loyal elite team, I finally showed them exactly who they were dealing with. I was not just a grieving, vulnerable widow. I was the relentless architect of an empire, and I was about to burn their entire fake world straight to the ground. Mr. Harrison stood perfectly still beside me, holding a thick manila envelope that he had not yet opened. The room was so quiet you could hear the heavy, erratic breathing of my brother Terrance echoing off the expensive wallpaper. Terrance thought the worst was over, but the demolition of his life had barely begun. I turned my gaze back to Dr. Evans, who was trembling visibly under the heavy hand of my security chief, Marcus. "Dr. Cole already proved your medical evaluation was completely fraudulent," I said, my voice steady and cold. "But that is only half of your problem tonight, Dr. Evans. Mr. Harrison, please show the good doctor exactly what kind of paper trail he left behind." Mr. Harrison calmly opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of financial documents. He tossed them onto the mahogany table right over Terrance's spilled scotch. "These are certified bank statements," Mr. Harrison explained, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "They detail a wire transfer of exactly $100,000 originating from a shell company in the Cayman Islands directly into your private offshore account, Dr. Evans. The shell company is registered to none other than Terrance." Dr. Evans let out a pathetic whimpering sound. His knees gave out completely, and he collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his shaking hands. He knew his medical license was gone, but now he was staring down the barrel of a federal bribery and conspiracy charge. The sleazy attorney, Mr. Davis, squeezed his eyes shut, knowing he was caught in the exact same criminal web. But Terrance could not stay quiet. His narcissistic ego simply would not allow him to surrender, even when he was completely surrounded and entirely defeated. "You cannot prove anything," Terrance suddenly shouted, his voice cracking as he slammed his fist on the table. "That money was a legitimate consulting fee for a business acquisition. You are invading my home and stealing my private corporate documents, Valerie. You are nothing but a jealous widow trying to ruin my venture capital firm because you know I am 10 times the business executive you will ever be." He was actually puffing his chest out, trying to assert dominance while his hired thugs were pinned to the wall. It was the ultimate display of absolute delusion. I walked slowly back to my seat and picked up my own leather briefcase from the floor. I placed it on the table and popped the golden latches. The sound echoed sharply in the silent room. "A venture capital firm implies that you actually have capital, Terrance," I replied smoothly, pulling out a thick-bound ledger. I tossed it heavily onto the table right in front of him. "This is the internal financial audit of your firm that my investigative team acquired this afternoon. You do not have a venture capital firm, Terrance. You have a glorified Ponzi scheme that is currently bleeding to death." Blair gasped loudly, clutching the pearls at her neck. Terrance's face went from a pale gray to an absolute stark white. He reached out with a trembling hand but pulled it back before touching the ledger as if the book itself would burn his fingers. "You are currently $15 million in the red," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. "You made a series of incredibly reckless investments in unsecured cryptocurrency startups, and when those failed, you panicked. You started borrowing heavily from aggressive private lenders who do not care about your Ivy League degree. Your corporate accounts are completely empty, Terrance. Your investors are already preparing to file massive fraud lawsuits, and your creditors are actively hunting you down. That is the real reason you needed my logistics company. You needed my liquid assets to cover your massive, staggering debt before the Federal Trade Commission kicks down your door." The facade was entirely stripped away. The handsome, successful brother who had looked down on me my entire life was sitting in front of me as a complete and utter fraud. Blair looked at her husband with an expression of pure horror. $15 million, she shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "Terrance, you told me the firm was having a record-breaking quarter. You just let me put a $50,000 down payment on the new winter cabin. Where did that money come from?" Terrance could not even look at his wife. He stared blankly at the mahogany table, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public exposure. But my mother, Corinne, still could not accept the reality of her precious golden child failing. She gripped the edges of the table, her knuckles turning white. "Valerie, this must be some kind of mistake," she pleaded, her voice desperate and shrill. "Your brother is a brilliant man. He would never let things get this far out of control. Even if the firm took a minor loss, he has plenty of assets to cover it. He has this beautiful estate and his investments. You are just twisting the numbers to make him look bad because you have always been so terribly jealous of him." I slowly turned my head to look at my mother. The sheer depth of her blind loyalty to a son who was actively destroying our family was both tragic and infuriating. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out one final document. It was a single sheet of paper printed on heavy legal stock with a bright blue notary seal stamped at the bottom. "I am not twisting any numbers, Mother," I said softly, placing the document gently in front of her. "But since you are so confident in his financial stability, you should probably take a very close look at this." Corinne leaned forward, squinting at the paper. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling with sudden uncertainty. "That is a second mortgage deed," I explained, my voice dropping to a cold, merciless whisper. Terrance did not just borrow money from shady private lenders. When his credit ran completely dry, he needed hard collateral to secure his final disastrous loan. So he used the only asset he had left access to. "He used your house, Mother." Corinne froze. Her eyes darted rapidly across the page, reading the legal jargon. "He forged your signature, Mother," I continued relentlessly. He took the home you fully paid off 10 years ago, the home where we grew up, and he leveraged it against a high-interest loan that he has already defaulted on. The bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings at the end of this month. Your golden child did not just try to steal my company today. He already secretly sold your home to save his own skin, and he was perfectly willing to let you get evicted while he sat here drinking expensive scotch. The silence that followed was absolute. Corinne let out a sound that was less of a cry and more of a hollow, broken gasp. The heavy document slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. She looked up at Terrance, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. The son she had worshipped her entire life, the son she had just helped plot to lock me in a psychiatric ward, had completely ruined her. Blair was shaking so violently, her emerald silk dress looked like it was vibrating. She turned her rage toward Terrance, her hands curled into fists. "You forged your mother's signature!" she screamed, completely abandoning her refined country club persona. "You told me we were royalty, Terrance. You told me Valerie was just a blue-collar truck driver who got lucky. All this time you were funding my life with stolen money and illegal loans." Terrance suddenly stood up, his chair sliding backward. "Shut up, Blair!" He snapped, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You spent millions of dollars on designer clothes and luxury vacations while I was desperately trying to keep the firm afloat. You are just a parasite who only loved me for my bank account, so do not stand there and act like some innocent victim." They were completely turning on each other, viciously tearing at whatever was left of their marriage. I stood by the table and watched the absolute carnage unfold. This was the family that had constantly made me feel inferior. This was the brother who thought an Ivy League degree gave him the right to steal my logistics empire. This was the mother who had willingly participated in a plot to drug and commit her own daughter, just to protect the false image of her perfect son. I looked at Mr. Harrison, who gave me a slow, respectful nod. The corporate security team remained perfectly still, guarding the exits and ensuring no one could escape the consequences of their actions. The hired doctor and lawyer were slumped in their chairs, entirely broken and awaiting their inevitable federal charges. The grand dining room, with its expensive crystal chandelier and heavy mahogany table, felt completely tainted. The rich smell of roasted meats was entirely overpowered by the thick, suffocating stench of fear and betrayal. I had not raised my voice once. I had not thrown a single glass or shed a single tear. I had simply brought the truth into the room and let it do all the heavy lifting. The silence in the room was finally broken by the sound of Dr. Evans violently pushing his chair backward. The reality of federal prison had finally pierced through his arrogant medical facade. He looked frantically at the splintered doorway where Marcus stood like an immovable mountain of muscle and tailored fabric. "Please, Mrs. Valerie," Dr. Evans begged, his voice pitching up into a pathetic whine. "I have a family. I have a private practice that took me 20 years to build. Terrance told me you were genuinely a danger to yourself and others. He told me I was providing a necessary medical intervention for a family in crisis. I never intended to commit fraud." I looked at the sweating doctor, feeling nothing but absolute contempt. Mr. Harrison stepped forward and dropped an even larger folder onto the table, the heavy thud echoing through the room. "That is the full comprehensive psychiatric evaluation Dr. Cole performed on me this morning." I explained, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "It contains brain scans, cognitive function tests, and a complete psychological profile. It proves without a shadow of a doubt that my mental acuity is operating at the top 1%. It also proves that any professional who observed me for even 5 minutes would know I do not suffer from complicated grief or intermittent explosive disorder." Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked at Dr. Evans with pure disgust. "You did not provide a medical intervention, doctor," he said sharply. You accepted a wire transfer of $100,000 from a shell company to falsify a diagnosis that would strip my client of her fundamental human rights and hand over a multi-million-dollar corporation to a man drowning in debt. That is not malpractice. That is conspiracy to commit fraud, medical extortion, and a direct violation of federal racketeering statutes. The sleazy attorney Mr. Davis could no longer handle the crushing weight of the legal reality closing in around him. He suddenly bolted. He grabbed his leather briefcase and sprinted toward the far end of the dining room, trying to reach the sliding glass doors that led out to the patio. He was desperately trying to escape into the dark suburban night. Marcus did not even break a sweat. He gave a simple hand signal, and two of my elite security operatives moved with terrifying precision. They intercepted Mr. Davis before he even reached the glass. One operative grabbed the back of the lawyer's cheap suit jacket and spun him around while the other easily disarmed him of his briefcase. Mr. Davis hit the hardwood floor hard, sliding a few feet before stopping directly at the polished leather shoes of Mr. Harrison. "You cannot hold me here," Mr. Davis screamed from the floor, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "This is unlawful detainment. You are kidnapping me." "You are free to leave, Mr. Davis," Mr. Harrison replied calmly, looking down at the pathetic man. "But if you step off of this property, my security team will immediately hand over your gold pen with the built-in audio recorder to the authorities, along with the documented proof that you drafted those fraudulent conservatorship papers, knowing Terrance had zero legal grounds. You are an accessory to a federal crime. If you leave now, you will be arrested at your office tomorrow morning in front of all your colleagues." Dr. Evans, seeing his legal counterpart completely neutralized, decided to try a different tactic. He turned his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward Terrance. "Tell them, Terrance," the doctor pleaded, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Tell them you coerced me. Tell them you promised me a position on the board of your new medical startup if I just signed that one piece of paper. You promised me absolute immunity." Terrance just stared at the wall, his jaw clenched, his entire body rigid with shock. He was completely useless to them now. The wealthy venture capitalist who had promised them easy money and legal protection was nothing more than a broke, desperate fraud. I walked slowly over to where Dr. Evans was standing and stopped just a few inches from him. I invaded his personal space the exact same way he had invaded mine when he sat across the table trying to trigger a manic episode. "You looked me right in the eye and tried to weaponize the tragic death of my husband, Doctor," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You tried to use the deepest trauma of my life to lock me inside a sterile room and drug me into submission just so you could buy a new luxury car or expand your private clinic. You are a disgrace to the medical profession, and I am going to make absolutely sure you never practice medicine again." Mr. Davis scrambled to his knees, his hands clasped together in a pathetic display of begging. He looked up at me, completely abandoning any loyalty he had to my brother. "Mrs. Valerie, I will testify." He blurted out the words, spilling from his mouth in a desperate rush. "I will give you everything. I have emails, text messages, and recorded phone calls proving Terrance orchestrated this entire plot. He reached out to me 3 weeks ago when his creditors threatened to break his legs. He knew your logistics company had liquid cash, and he needed to steal it to survive. I will turn state's evidence. I will give you Terrance on a silver platter. Just please do not send me to federal prison." Terrance finally snapped out of his silent shock. He lunged toward Mr. Davis. His fists raised, a look of pure, murderous rage twisting his handsome features. "You miserable little rat!" Terrance roared, trying to attack the lawyer who had just sold him out. But Marcus was faster. Before Terrance could even take 2 steps, Marcus grabbed him by the back of the neck and slammed him face first down onto the mahogany dining table. The heavy wood groaned under the impact, and several expensive wine glasses shattered, sending shards of crystal scattering across the floor. Terrance let out a muffled groan of pain as Marcus effortlessly pinned his arms behind his back, holding him down like a misbehaving child. Blair screamed and covered her face with her hands, trembling violently in the corner of the room. My mother, Corinne, remained frozen in her chair, unable to comprehend the brutal physical reality of her son's complete downfall. The sophisticated upper-class dinner party had fully descended into the criminal crime scene it was always meant to be. Mr. Harrison calmly stepped over the shattered crystal and picked up Mr. Davis from the floor, pulling the sleazy lawyer to his feet. "We will gladly accept all of your evidence, Mr. Davis," the litigator said, adjusting his tie. "But you do not negotiate with my client. You negotiate with the federal prosecutors who are currently reviewing the extensive dossier we submitted to them 2 hours ago." I watched these two highly educated men completely fall apart right in front of my eyes. In my industry, out on the loading docks and in the shipping yards, a person's word actually meant something. We built our logistics empire on trust, reliability, and the sheer physical grind of moving freight across the country. But here in this multi-million-dollar suburban mansion surrounded by fine art and imported rugs, trust was just another currency to be manipulated. Dr. Evans took a sacred oath to protect human life, and he sold it for a wire transfer. Mr. Davis took an oath to uphold the law, and he weaponized it for a cheap payday. They represented everything Adam and I despised about the corporate world. Marcus kept his heavy hand pressed firmly against the back of Terrance's neck, keeping my brother pinned flat against the ruined dining table. Terrance's expensive custom suit was covered in spilled scotch and shattered glass. He was breathing heavily, his cheek pressed hard against the polished wood. He looked pathetic. "Let him up," I told Marcus, my voice quiet but echoing perfectly in the silent room. Marcus immediately stepped back, releasing his grip. Terrance slowly pushed himself off the table, wiping a mixture of scotch and sweat from his face. He refused to look at me. He refused to look at his wife or his mother. He just stared at the floor, his chest heaving. "This is what happens, Terrance," I said softly, walking around the table until I was standing right in his line of sight. "This is what happens when you spend your entire life believing that you are inherently better than everyone else simply because Mother told you so. You thought you could outsmart me because I drive a desk at a trucking company and you sit in a glass tower managing imaginary money. But my money is real, Terrance. My power is real. And the consequences you are facing tonight are very real." Dr. Evans let out a long, trembling sigh and slowly slid down the wall until he was sitting on the hardwood floor, his head resting on his knees. He looked like a broken man, completely stripped of his arrogant professional dignity. Mr. Davis stood frozen in the center of the room, his shoulders slumped, his breathing shallow and rapid. My security team flanked the exits, their presence a constant, heavy reminder that there was absolutely no escape from the nightmare these people had created for themselves. The trap had been sprung. The hired help had been neutralized and turned into cooperative witnesses. All that was left now was to deal with the family members who had orchestrated this massive betrayal. Blair and Corinne were about to realize that the shield of family loyalty they always hid behind had just been shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Terrance pushed himself up to his full height, aggressively adjusting the collar of his ruined suit jacket. His narcissistic ego simply could not tolerate the crushing humiliation of being physically pinned to his own dining table in front of his wife and mother. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely unhinged, bouncing off the high ceilings of the lavish room. He started to pace back and forth, kicking a piece of shattered crystal out of his way, trying to physically assert his dominance over the space. "Valerie, you are so incredibly dramatic," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You bring your little corporate thugs in here and throw around these fabricated ledgers to make yourself feel important. Every major venture capital firm experiences temporary liquidity issues during market corrections. You drive trucks for a living. You manage blue-collar mechanics and warehouse workers. You have absolutely no idea how high-level institutional investment actually works. I am an Ivy League-educated chief executive and I manage complex portfolios that your tiny little brain could not even begin to comprehend." He was actually puffing out his chest, trying to rebuild his shattered authority, by using the exact same condescending tone he had used to belittle me since childhood. He desperately needed Blair and Corinne to believe that he was still the untouchable golden child holding the reins of the family empire. He stood near the head of the table trying to look like the undisputed king of the castle. Mr. Harrison looked at Terrance and let out a soft, genuine chuckle. I did not even need to speak. I just nodded calmly at my attorney. Mr. Harrison reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a large stack of glossy printed photographs, financial flowcharts, and text message transcripts, dropping them right on top of the ruined conservatorship documents. If you are managing complex institutional portfolios, Terrance, Mr. Harrison said, his voice dripping with absolute professional mockery, then perhaps you can explain to your family why you wired over $8 million into an unregistered offshore cryptocurrency exchange managed by a 22-year-old internet influencer who is currently hiding in the Bahamas. The forced, arrogant smile vanished from Terrance's face instantly. His pacing stopped dead. I stepped forward, tapping my manicured fingernail against the top photograph. It was a screenshot of Terrance's private messaging account. You did not lose $15 million in a complex market correction, Terrance, I said, my voice sharp and entirely unforgiving. You lost it because you are a gullible, arrogant fool who thought you were smarter than the global financial markets. You poured your client's entire life savings into digital meme coins because a teenager on the internet promised you a 300% return in 30 days. An Ivy League education, and you fell for a digital scam that my warehouse dock workers would have laughed at. Blair let out a sharp, horrified gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Digital meme coins, she repeated, her voice trembling with absolute disgust and disbelief. Terrance, you told me you were investing in advanced artificial intelligence and sustainable energy infrastructure. You told the country club board of directors that you were a pioneer in the global tech industry. You made me brag to my friends about your visionary investments. Shut up, Blair! Terrance roared, his face turning a deep, violent shade of crimson. You know nothing about modern finance or market trends. It was a highly calculated risk that experienced a temporary volatility curve. I am still a financial genius, and I am still the unquestioned head of this family. I will fix this. I always fix everything because I am a winner. You fix absolutely nothing. Terrance, I shot back, stepping even closer, forcing him to back up against the edge of the mahogany table. Mother and father spent their entire lives fixing your mistakes. They bought you your passing grades, they bought your college admission, and they bought your first executive job title to make you look good. But they cannot buy you out of the massive bleeding mess you are in now. Because when the cryptocurrency scam entirely collapsed, and your investors started asking for their quarterly dividends, you did not go to a traditional bank. You went straight to the underground. I picked up the thick stack of text message transcripts and held them up to the bright light of the crystal chandelier, ensuring everyone could see the black ink. These are the encrypted messages you sent to a man named Victor. Starting exactly 3 months ago, I read aloud, keeping my tone absolutely clinical and detached. Victor is a known associate of a highly organized criminal syndicate operating out of the city. You borrowed $7 million in untraceable cash from a loan shark, Terrance. A violent loan shark who charges an illegal 30% monthly interest rate. My mother, Corinne, let out a horrifying choked sound, gripping her chest tightly, as if she was experiencing sudden physical heart failure. Terrance. She wheezed, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Loan sharks, criminals! Terrance, tell me she is lying to us. Please tell me you did not bring violent criminals into our lives. Terrance opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat moved rapidly as he tried to swallow the massive lump of his own inescapable guilt. He cannot tell you that, Mother, because it is the absolute terrifying truth. I continued, relentlessly turning to face her. Why do you think Terrance suddenly hired these 2 massive private security guards to stand in his dining room tonight? They are not here to protect him from a grieving widow. They are here because Victor sent him a text message yesterday afternoon, threatening to break both of his kneecaps and take this massive suburban house if he did not produce a multi-million-dollar payment by midnight tonight. He was going to use my money to pay off the mob. Terrance's knees visibly buckled under the crushing weight of the truth. He leaned heavily against the mahogany wood, completely stripped of his fake executive armor. The reality of his profound stupidity was laid bare for everyone in the room to witness. He was not a financial mastermind navigating complex institutional investments. He was a desperate, pathetic gambler who had lost millions of dollars on internet jokes and then begged violent street criminals to save him from bankruptcy. The shiny, expensive veneer of his life had completely melted away, revealing the rotting, pathetic core underneath. His custom-tailored suit, his luxury imported cars, his elite country club memberships, it was all a pathetic illusion built on a fragile foundation of lies and stolen money. The Ivy League businessman was officially dead. Standing in his place was a terrified little boy, waiting for the inevitable, devastating consequences of his own disastrous arrogance to finally catch up with him. The silence in the room was heavy, but my mother Corinne refused to let it settle. She stared at the mortgage document on the floor for several long seconds and then simply shook her head slowly from side to side. The deep psychological denial of a narcissistic enabler is a truly terrifying thing to witness. She reached down with trembling fingers, picked up the heavy legal paper, and placed it back on the mahogany table, pushing it away from her as if it were a physical poison. "No, Valerie, you are lying to me," my mother said, her voice pitching up into a desperate high frequency. "Terrance would never do such a thing to his own mother. He is an Ivy League graduate and a respected chief executive." Every great businessman faces temporary setbacks and liquidity issues. Businesses take losses all the time. He probably just used the house as a temporary guarantee to secure a bridge loan. He is going to pay it back as soon as the market corrects itself. You are just trying to confuse me with all these papers because you want to destroy him. She actually reached out and placed a comforting hand on Terrance's shoulder. Terrance, who was still dripping in sweat and spilled scotch, refused to even look up at her. He knew the game was completely over, but Corinne was still desperately trying to play it. I let out a heavy sigh and looked at my mother with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "Mother, you are looking at a legal foreclosure document," I said, speaking very slowly as if I were explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler. "There is no bridge loan. There is no market correction. Terrance did not make a bad business deal. He stole your identity and forged your signature on a massive second mortgage to pay off a violent criminal syndicate." Corinne shook her head faster, her pearl necklace rattling against her chest. "No, he told me he needed my signature for a simple tax form last year," she stammered blindly, defending the son who had just ruined her. "He told me it was just routine paperwork for the family trust." Mr. Harrison stepped forward, pulling a stack of bright red envelopes from his briefcase. He dropped them onto the table right next to the forged deed. "These are the final notice foreclosure warnings from the bank." "Corinne," Mr. Harrison stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "They have been mailing these to your house for the past 3 months, but you never saw them, did you?" Corinne's eyes widened as she stared at the red envelopes. She looked at Terrance, her hand slowly slipping off his shoulder. "Terrance, you come over every single Tuesday morning for coffee?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You always insist on checking the mail for me. You told me you were just being a helpful son." "He was intercepting your mail, Mother," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of her delusion. "He was stealing the bank notices right out of your mailbox, so you would not find out that your fully paid-off home now belongs to a predatory lending corporation. He hired a corrupt public notary to falsify your thumbprint and your signature on the closing documents. He completely liquidated the equity you spent 30 years building, and he threw it into an unregistered digital currency scam. The bank legally seized the property deed 10 days ago. You do not own a home anymore, Mother. You have exactly 14 days to vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrives to physically remove your belongings and lock you out. The sheer absolute finality of my words finally broke through her massive wall of denial. The illusion of the successful golden boy completely shattered into a million irreversible pieces. Corinne's knees visibly buckled beneath her. She let out a loud, agonizing gasp and slumped heavily into her dining chair. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning completely white as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. My house! She choked out a single tear, finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting a track through her expensive makeup. My beautiful house. I hosted the charity garden club there for 20 years. All my antique furniture. My garden. Where am I supposed to go? Terrance, where am I supposed to live? Terrance kept his eyes glued to the floor, refusing to witness the total devastation he had caused. I was going to win it back, Mom, he mumbled weakly, his voice sounding like a pathetic child. The crypto market was supposed to rebound. I just needed a few more weeks to double the investment and pay off the mortgage. I was going to buy you an even bigger house. You were going to leave her completely homeless, Terrance. I snapped, my voice echoing sharply in the large room. You gambled her absolute security on an internet joke because your ego could not handle the fact that your venture capital firm was a colossal failure. Corinne covered her face with both hands and began to openly sob. It was a deep, ugly sound filled with absolute terror and profound humiliation. She was nearly 60 years old. She had spent her entire adult life parading around the country club, acting superior to everyone else, looking down on people who worked manual labor. She had constantly ridiculed my logistics company, calling it dirty and inappropriate for a woman of my social standing. And now she was staring down the barrel of total bankruptcy, realizing she would likely have to move into a tiny state-funded apartment. She suddenly pulled her hands away from her face and looked directly at me. Her eyes were red and swollen, entirely stripped of their usual arrogant pride. Valerie, she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. Valerie, you have to help me. You own a multi-million-dollar company. You have massive corporate accounts and liquid cash. You can just write a check to the bank and pay off the mortgage. You can save my house. Please, Valerie, I am your mother. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the woman who had allowed my brother to lock me in this very room tonight. I looked at the woman who was perfectly willing to let a corrupt doctor drug me and strap me to a hospital gurney so Terrance could steal my company. And now she wanted me to use my hard-earned trucking money to save her from the consequences of her own blind favoritism. Mother, I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. An hour ago, you told me I was a sick, fragile woman who was completely out of touch with reality. You told me to hand over my life to Terrance because he was the brilliant Ivy League savior of this family. You sat in that chair and watched him threaten my freedom. You did not care if I lost everything as long as your precious son got what he wanted. I paused, letting the absolute silence of the room amplify my next words. I am not writing a check, Mother. I am not saving your house. You chose your golden child, and now you get to experience exactly what it costs to worship a fraud. Corinne let out a piercing wail of pure despair, burying her head in her arms on the table. She was completely broken. Her foolishness, her vanity, and her toxic enabling had finally delivered the ultimate devastating payoff. She had absolutely nothing left. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of the secrets I had already laid bare. But I was not finished. Not even close. I turned my gaze from my brother to his wife. Blair sat frozen on the edge of the designer sofa, her posture rigid, her hands clutching her pearl necklace, as if it could somehow protect her from the storm I had brought into her immaculate living room. For years, Blair had been the benchmark of perfection in this family. She was the ideal upper-class wife, hosting charity galas, serving on hospital boards, and never missing an opportunity to look down her perfectly contoured nose at my supposed failures. She had spent a decade treating me like dirt beneath her expensive heels. Now it was her turn to face the truth. "What are you looking at?" Valerie Blair snapped, trying to summon her usual haughty tone, but her voice betrayed a slight tremor. "You have caused enough damage here today. I think it is time for you to leave. I will leave when I am good and ready." "Blair," I said evenly. I reached into my bag and pulled out the tablet I had prepared specifically for this moment. With a few quick taps, I connected it to the massive smart television mounted above their marble fireplace. "But first, I think Terrance needs to see where his company profits have actually been going." Terrance looked up, his face still pale from the previous confrontation. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Leave my company out of this." "I wish I could," I replied, pressing a button on the screen. Instantly, the large television lit up with spreadsheets and banking records. The logo of Terrance's logistics firm sat at the top of the documents, followed by rows upon rows of highlighted transactions. "These are the corporate accounts for your firm, Terrance," I explained, keeping my voice steady and clear. "The accounts Blair has had administrative access to since she graciously volunteered to help you transition your bookkeeping 3 years ago." Blair jumped to her feet, her face suddenly devoid of color. "Turn that off right now. Those are private financial records. You have no right to access them." "I have every right," I countered smoothly. "Especially since your careless accountant accidentally copied my consulting firm on the quarterly audit last month. A small mistake that led to a very large discovery." Terrance squinted at the screen, his confusion slowly transforming into horror as he read the numbers. "Wait, this cannot be right. These transfer amounts are massive. 50,000 here, 100,000 there. They are all being routed to a shell company, a company registered under Blair's maiden name," I clarified. "Over the past 2 years, exactly $2 million has been systematically siphoned from your operating budget into that account." The room erupted into chaos. My parents gasped. Terrance stood up, knocking his chair backward. He turned to his wife, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Blair, tell me this is a joke. Tell me this is some sort of accounting error." Blair was stammering, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her expensive clutch to the floor. "Terrance, I can explain. It was for investments. I was trying to secure our future, to build a safety net for the children. A safety net." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through her pathetic lies. "Let us see what kind of safety net you were building." I swiped my finger across the tablet. The spreadsheets vanished, replaced by high-resolution photographs. The first picture showed Blair at an exclusive resort in Aspen, laughing as she sipped champagne. Beside her, with his arm wrapped intimately around her waist, was a young and incredibly fit man who could not have been older than 23. "Everyone meet Julian," I announced to the silent room. Blair's highly compensated personal tennis coach. My mother let out a strangled cry and covered her mouth. Terrance stared at the screen as if it were a physical monster about to attack him. I swiped to the next photo. It was a picture of Julian leaning against a brand-new luxury sports car. The caption I had overlaid at the bottom showed the vehicle registration. "Paid in full. By Blair's Shell Company." "It turns out Julian offers more than just backhand lessons," I continued relentlessly. "The $2 million you embezzled from your husband's company, the money that caused Terrance to lay off 20 employees last December because of unforeseen budget shortfalls, went entirely to funding Julian's lavish lifestyle. Designer clothes, luxury sports cars, and five-star vacations, while Terrance was working 80-hour weeks to keep his business afloat." Blair was hyperventilating now. "Stop it. Turn it off. You are ruining my life." "You ruined your own life, Blair," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I am just turning on the lights so everyone can see the mess." I swiped to the final piece of evidence. It was a series of private investigator photos taken outside a boutique hotel downtown. They showed Blair and Julian in a passionate embrace by the valet stand, their faces clearly visible under the street lamps. The timestamp on the photos was from last month, on the exact night Blair had supposedly organized a charity gala for the children's hospital. Terrance looked physically ill. He stumbled backward, leaning against the wall for support. "A tennis coach," he whispered, his voice breaking. You stole from my company from our children's future to play sugar mama to a boy 10 years younger than you. Terrance, please. Blair begged, tears finally spilling over her perfectly applied makeup. She reached out for him, but he recoiled as if her touch would burn him. It meant nothing. I was just lonely. You were always working. You ignored me. I was working to provide for you. Terrance shouted, his anger finally breaking through the shock. I was trying to figure out why my company was bleeding money. I almost declared bankruptcy, Blair. I almost lost everything we built, and it was because you were robbing me blind to sleep with some kid. The perfect upper-class wife persona that Blair had wielded like a weapon for a decade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked pathetic, standing there in her designer dress, exposed as a thief and a cheat, in front of the very family she had spent years trying to impress and control. My parents sat in stunned silence. My mother, who had always praised Blair's elegance and dedication to the family, looked at her daughter-in-law with pure disgust. The golden couple, the standard I had always been measured against and punished for failing to meet, was nothing but an expensive and rotten illusion. You always loved pointing out my flaws, Blair, I said softly, ensuring every word landed with precision. You called me a failure at every holiday dinner. You told me I lacked the discipline to build a successful life. But at least the life I built is honest. At least I do not have to steal from my family to buy affection. Blair sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands as she sobbed uncontrollably. There was no defense she could offer, no lie clever enough to explain away the documents and the photographs glowing brightly on the screen above her. Terrance turned to me, his eyes red and his expression completely defeated. The arrogance he had displayed earlier was entirely gone, replaced by the profound realization that his perfect life was a complete lie. He looked from the screen to his crying wife, then back to me. I closed the cover of my tablet and slipped it back into my bag. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the heavy and undeniable truth that I had brought into the light. I had dismantled the pedestal they had forced me to worship for years, and watching it crumble was the most liberating moment of my life. The heavy silence in the room lasted only a few seconds before the reality of my revelations finally ignited. Terrance let out a sound that was half sob and half roar. He lunged across the space between them, grabbing Blair by the shoulders of her expensive silk dress. He shook her violently, his face inches from hers, spitting his words with a venom I had never heard from him before. $2 million, Blair! He screamed, his voice cracking with rage. I almost lost my company. I fired loyal employees who had mortgages to pay because you needed to buy sports cars for a boy. I trusted you with everything. Blair shrieked and tried to push him away, her hands flailing wildly. Get off me, Terrance, she cried, her perfect hair now a tangled mess around her tear-stained face. You were never home. You cared more about that stupid logistics firm than you ever cared about me. I deserve to be happy. Happy, a shrill voice echoed through the room. It was my mother. Corinne had finally snapped out of her stunned paralysis. Her face, usually so composed and injected with Botox, was twisted into a mask of pure fury. She marched toward the struggling couple and grabbed Blair by the arm, yanking her away from Terrance with surprising strength. You ungrateful, parasitic little tramp, my mother screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. We gave you everything. We welcomed you into this family. We gave you the status and the lifestyle you were desperate for, and this is how you repay us. You ruined my son. Blair stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. She fell hard against the glass coffee table, sending crystal vases and silver trays crashing to the marble floor. The sound of shattering glass was deafening, a perfect physical manifestation of the destruction I had just unleashed upon their lives. Do not you dare touch me, Corinne. Blair spat back, scrambling to her feet like a cornered animal. Do not act like you are so perfect. You only liked me because I looked good in your family photos. You are a shallow, bitter old woman who cares more about country club gossip than her own children. My father jumped up from his chair, his face red and his chest heaving. That is enough, he bellowed, trying to step between his wife and his daughter-in-law. Everyone calm down this instant. We need to handle this quietly. Quietly, Terrance laughed, a hysterical, manic sound that sent chills down my spine. There is no quietly anymore, Dad. She stole millions. That is a federal crime. I am calling the police. I am calling my lawyers. You are going to jail, Blair. I will make sure you do not get a single dime in the divorce. The elegant living room had completely devolved into a pathetic circus of betrayal and greed. My mother was cursing at Blair, calling her names I had never heard her use in my entire life. Blair was screaming back, threatening to expose my parents' own financial secrets if they tried to destroy her. Terrance was pacing the floor, tearing at his hair, muttering about lawsuits and bankruptcy. And I just sat back and watched. I leaned against the back of the sofa, crossing my arms, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me amidst the absolute chaos. For my entire life, these people had made me the villain. They had bonded over their shared disdain for me, using my supposed failures as the glue that held their fragile egos together. They had built an empire of lies and projected an image of absolute perfection, demanding that I bow to it. But without me as their designated scapegoat, without a common enemy to distract them, they had nothing left but their own toxic greed. They were tearing each other apart, ripping off the masks of upper-class civility to reveal the ugly parasitic nature underneath. I watched as Blair threw a handful of broken flowers at my mother, screaming about how Terrance was a failure in bed. I watched my brother, the golden boy who could do no wrong, sobbing uncontrollably on the floor amidst the shattered crystal. I watched my parents, who had always demanded absolute respect and decorum, shrieking like wild animals in their ruined living room. They had spent years trying to break me, trying to make me feel small and worthless so they could feel big and important. But I was the one walking away with my dignity intact. I did not need to scream or cry or throw things. The truth had done all the heavy lifting for me. As the screaming reached a fever pitch, with Terrance now holding his phone and dialing his attorney, I realized my work here was completely finished. There was nothing more for me to say. The fire I had started was burning perfectly, and they were the ones throwing more gasoline on the flames. The chaos continued to swirl around the ruined living room until the reality of Terrance and his impending bankruptcy finally pierced through my mother's hysteria. Corinne stopped screaming at Blair and slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes, previously filled with venom, suddenly widened with a desperate realization. The massive wealth I had just revealed, the millions I had built with my own logistics empire, was sitting right in front of her. She scrambled over the shattered crystal and broken flowers on the floor, practically crawling toward the sofa where I sat. Her expensive dress was torn at the hem, and her makeup was running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "Valerie, please," she begged, her voice trembling, with a sickeningly sweet tone that made my stomach turn. "You have to help your brother." "You heard him. He is going to lose everything. The business, this house, his reputation. You have more than enough money to cover the 2 million Blair stole. You can save the family. Blood is thicker than water, Valerie. We are your family." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing. The sheer audacity of her request was almost comical. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked directly into her tearful eyes. "Blood is thicker than water," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the heavy air of the room. "That is a fascinating choice of words, Corinne. Where was that blood loyalty when I was working 18-hour days, sleeping on the concrete floor of my first warehouse because I could not afford to pay rent for an apartment and keep my business afloat at the same time? Where was that family bond when you and Dad co-signed Terrance on his third luxury vehicle, but refused to loan me $500 to fix my delivery van?" My mother flinched and opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing her instantly. "Do not interrupt me," I commanded, my voice cold and unyielding. "You want to talk about saving the family. This family is nothing but a facade. You and Dad took out a second mortgage on your house just to maintain your country club membership so you could parade Terrance around like a prince. You worshipped a fake bougie lifestyle, burying yourselves in debt to buy designer clothes and luxury cars you could not afford, all while mocking my cheap clothes and calloused hands. You call yourselves high class, but true. Hustle is building something out of nothing, exactly what I did. You and Terrance just polished a rotting apple and demanded the world tell you how shiny it was. Valerie. We made mistakes, my father chimed in from across the room, his voice shaking. But she is right. We are still your family. You cannot just let your brother go to prison or lose his livelihood. I shifted my gaze to my father, then back to my mother who was still kneeling on the floor. Exactly 30 minutes ago, I said softly, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. 30 minutes ago you were standing right there handing Terrance your phone. You were actively encouraging him to call a psychiatric facility to have me committed against my will. You were ready to lock your own daughter in a padded room and declare her legally incompetent just so you could steal the company I built from the ground up. Corinne looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes, as shame finally washed over her face. You wanted to bury me alive to fund your pathetic illusion of wealth? I continued, standing up from the sofa and towering over her. So do not you dare kneel there and preach to me about blood. As of this exact moment, I have no mother. I have no father. And I certainly have no brother. My legal team has already drafted the formal severance documents. Any attempt by any of you to contact me, my business, or my employees will be met with immediate restraining orders and harassment lawsuits. I am cutting out the rot, and I am leaving you all exactly where you belong, with each other. Terrance, who had been listening to my entire monologue while gripping his phone tightly in his hand, let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He wiped his nose on his sleeve and puffed out his chest, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny fragment of his shattered ego remained. Fine, Terrance sneered, his face twisted in a mixture of hatred and panic. Keep your dirty money, Valerie. I do not need it. I will just declare bankruptcy. Let the creditors take this stupid house and all of Blair's expensive garbage. I will start over. But you are in my house right now and you are trespassing. I am calling the local police to come drag you out of here in handcuffs. We will see how smug you look when they throw you in the back of a squad car. He began aggressively jabbing his thumb against the screen of his phone, dialing the local precinct. My parents watched him with a mixture of fear and twisted pride, still clinging to the delusion that Terrance was the man of the house taking control of the situation. Blair just sobbed louder into her hands, completely broken. Instead of rushing to the door or showing any sign of panic, I calmly reached over to the unbroken side of the glass coffee table. I picked up a crystal tumbler filled with iced water that Blair had poured for me when I first arrived. I brought it to my lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down. I looked at Terrance and offered him a wide, genuine smile. Terrance paused, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you smiling at, you psycho?" he barked, his voice wavering slightly. "Get out of my house before the cops get here." "I am not going anywhere, Terrance," I said smoothly, walking slowly toward the center of the room, my heels crunching on the broken glass. "In fact, I was hoping you would stay exactly where you are. I only came here today and dragged this whole spectacle out to buy some time." Terrance lowered his phone, his eyes darting around the room as a new wave of panic began to set in. "Buying time for what? You still think this is a local civil matter?" I laughed softly, shaking my head at his sheer ignorance. "You think you can just file for Chapter 11? Bankruptcy? Shed a few tears in front of a local judge and walk away with a clean slate? You really are as stupid as Blair thought you were." Blair stopped crying and looked up, her makeup-ruined face completely pale. "The money Blair embezzled did not just sit in a local bank account," I explained, enjoying the absolute terror that was rapidly returning to my brother's face. In order to fund Julian's luxury lifestyle, Blair had to move those $2 million through a series of shell companies across 3 different state lines. She used your corporate credentials to authorize the wire transfers. Your signature is on the fraudulent tax returns you filed last year to cover up the missing operating budget. Terrance stopped breathing. The phone slipped from his hand and landed with a dull thud on the carpet. Wire fraud, I listed on my fingers. Federal tax evasion, money laundering, and crossing state lines with stolen corporate assets. Those are not local police matters, Terrance. And they are certainly not things you can just erase with a bankruptcy claim. You and Blair are not going to a local civil court. The color completely drained from his face as the magnitude of his reality finally crushed him. He stumbled backward until his back hit the wall, his eyes wide with a fear so profound it was almost palpable. My parents were completely silent, paralyzed by the legal terms I had just dropped on their golden child. I checked my watch, noting the time with a satisfied nod. I did not need to run from the local police, Terrance. I whispered the silence in the room, amplifying my voice. Because 30 minutes ago, right around the time Mom wanted to lock me in a psych ward, my attorneys handed over every single spreadsheet, bank record, and private investigator photograph to the federal authorities. The words hung in the air for only a fraction of a second before a distant sound began to build in the background. It started as a faint wail, but quickly amplified into a deafening chorus of sirens piercing the quiet night of their exclusive gated community. Terrance whipped his head toward the tall arched windows of the living room, just as intense flashes of red and blue lights flooded through the glass, painting the shattered crystal and pale faces of my family in sharp, alternating colors. The heavy oak front door did not just open, it was breached. Heavy footsteps echoed in the grand foyer, completely drowning out Blair's frantic sobbing. These were not the local police Terrance had intended to call to file a petty trespassing complaint. Men and women wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI and IRS printed across their backs poured into the house. They moved with swift tactical precision, fanning out across the main floor and securing the perimeter before a senior agent stepped into the ruined living room. Terrance raised his hands instinctively, his phone dropping to the floor for the final time. "Officer, there must be some mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking under the sheer weight of his terror. "I am a respected business owner in this community. This is a private residence. It is not a mistake, Terrance," I said smoothly, not moving an inch from my spot in the center of the room. "As I just explained, you do not get to claim bankruptcy when you are dealing with federal felonies." The wire fraud Blair committed to funnel $2 million to her lover across state lines triggered the initial red flags. But when my team dug deeper into your own company records, we found the rest. The tax evasion, the manipulated corporate filings, and the forged trust documents you and Dad created to try and siphon off my logistics profits before I officially cut ties. You built your entire fake empire on federal crimes. The senior agent pulled a folded warrant from his jacket pocket and began reading Terrance and Blair their rights. My parents huddled together on the far side of the sofa, looking like frightened children, as the reality of federal prison loomed over their golden boy. But the night was not over, and the final piece of my strategy was about to fall perfectly into place. Amidst the chaos of agents taking photographs and cataloging the scene, a quiet and familiar figure stepped through the arched doorway of the dining room. It was Elena, the housekeeper my family had employed for the past 5 years. She was no longer wearing her crisp uniform apron, and her posture was no longer bowed in the subservient manner my mother always demanded. She walked with her head held high, completely ignoring my mother's confused stare, and came to stand directly by my side. "What is she doing?" my mother shrieked, her voice raspy from her earlier hysteria. "Elena, get away from her and go wait in the kitchen. She does not take orders from you anymore, Corinne," I replied, placing a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "In fact, she has been working for me for the last 6 months." Terrance's eyes darted between me and the woman who had scrubbed his floors and ironed his shirts. "Working for you," he repeated numbly. I nodded, offering Elena a warm smile before turning my cold gaze back to my brother. "You see, Terrance, you and Blair were so arrogant. You treated Elena like she was invisible. You talked about your shell companies, your offshore accounts, and your fake tax returns right in front of her while she was pouring your coffee. You thought because she was the help she was deaf and stupid. You never bothered to realize that the woman you paid minimum wage to clean up your messes was the very architect of your downfall. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of master keys, the ones Blair had entrusted her with to manage the estate. While I was in here keeping all of you occupied with my little presentation, Elena explained, her voice steady and confident. I used these to unlock the back terrace doors. I led the federal agents straight into your locked home office, Terrance. He let out a strangled gasp, his knees finally giving out completely as he slumped against the wall. They did not even have to break down the door, I added cheerfully. Elena handed them the physical ledgers you hid behind the bookshelf. She also gave them the passwords to your encrypted hard drives. While we were arguing in here, the agents were in the back of the house cloning your entire server. They have every single deleted email, every hidden transaction, and every fake invoice you ever created. The look of pure devastation on my family's faces was absolute poetry. They had spent their entire lives treating people like garbage, stepping on anyone they deemed beneath them to maintain their pathetic illusion of superiority. They had underestimated me, and they had completely overlooked the quiet woman who knew every single one of their dirty secrets. The invisible help had just handed them over to the federal government on a silver platter. The senior agent stepped forward, motioning for two officers to bring out the handcuffs. Terrance did not even fight as the cold metal snapped around his wrists. Blair screamed and thrashed as an agent secured her arms behind her back, her designer dress tearing further as they marched her toward the front door. My parents just wept, finally realizing that their money, their status, and their country club memberships could not save them from the consequences of their own toxic greed. I stood beside Elena, watching the flashing lights illuminate the faces of my brother and his wife as they were led out into the cold night. The empire of lies was officially burned to the ground, and I had never breathed easier in my entire life. The purge was not quite finished yet. Just as Terrance was being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, a sleek silver Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway. Out stepped Dr. Evans, the private psychiatrist my parents had kept on retainer for years, the very man my mother had called earlier to falsely commit me. He took one look at the flashing lights and tried to get back into his car, but two agents were already on him. Within seconds, he was pressed against his own hood, being read his Miranda rights for his role in the fraudulent medical conspiracy they had planned to use against me to seize my assets. Inside the house, a female agent was systematically stripping Blair of her stolen glamour. "Take off the necklace, Mum," the agent ordered firmly. Blair sobbed as she unclasped the diamond tennis necklace, followed by her heavy gold bracelets and her sapphire earrings. Everything purchased with illicit funds was being seized right there on the spot. Her offshore accounts and shell companies had already been frozen by the IRS. An agent handed her a small basic purse containing only her identification and a dead cell phone, and then she was escorted out the front door into the freezing night. She had nowhere to go, no money, and no rich husband to hide behind anymore. My mother, Corinne, remained completely frozen on the ruined living room floor. My father sat beside her, staring blankly at the wall. They finally understood the absolute finality of their situation. Terrance was going to federal prison. Their own home, which they had leveraged to the hilt to support his failing business and their fake wealthy lifestyle, would be seized by his creditors before the end of the month. There would be no more country club dinners, no more charity galas, and no more pretending to be local royalty. Corinne looked up at me, her eyes hollow, finally grasping the terrifying reality that her future was not a luxury penthouse, but a state-funded senior living facility. I turned my back on them without a single word of goodbye. I walked out through the grand double doors of the mansion and took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. It tasted like absolute freedom. Elena followed me out to the driveway, where my black Maybach was waiting, the engine purring softly. I turned to her and reached into my coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. I handed it to her. She opened it under the glow of the street lamp. and her eyes immediately filled with tears. It was a cashier's check for $500,000. You earned every penny of that, Elena, I told her softly. It is time for you to retire from cleaning up other people's messes. Go open that bakery you always talked about. She hugged me tightly, weeping and thanking me before turning to walk down the quiet street, a free woman with a brand new life ahead of her. I slid into the plush leather backseat of my car and told my driver to head back to the city. As the gated community faded into the rearview mirror, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was returning to the empire I built, surrounded by people who respected my hard work and valued my mind. The chapter of my life where I played the victim was permanently closed. Sometimes the toxicity in our lives is wrapped up in the clever disguise of family. We are taught to forgive everything, to endure endless abuse just because we share the same bloodline. But let me tell you a hard truth. You do not owe loyalty to people who view your destruction as their opportunity. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm, even if those abusers are your own parents or siblings. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to save your own sanity? How did you find the strength to finally cut the cord? Tell me your story in the comments below. And if my journey resonated with you today, please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more stories of resilience and truth. Share this with someone who needs the courage to walk away from their own toxic environment. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth is never determined by those who are too blind to see it.